Despite the benefits of trade and specialization, countries restrict trade. These restrictions include tariffs and non-tariff regulations. Tariffs are import duties and anti-dumping taxes. Dumping is when a country exports large quantities of product at prices lower than cost or the market price. Import duties or tariffs are taxes levied on a particular foreign product entering a country. This graph shows the level of tariffs charged by region. General trend has been to reduce tariffs, and industrialized countries tend to charge lower levels of tariffs than the rest. Currently, Sub-Saharan Africa charges the highest tariffs. There are also non-tariff restrictions. These are non-tax measures imposed by a government to favor domestic over foreign suppliers. Let's define some of them. Import quotas limit the amount of a particular good that might be imported during a given time. Embargoes are a complete halt of trade with a particular nation of a particular product. The US embargo of Cuba and North Korea are well-known examples of embargoes. Foreign exchange control is a restriction on how much foreign currency can be purchased or sold. This might affect or limit the imports of a country whose country exchange is being controlled. Currency devaluation is the reduction of value of a nation's currency relative to the currencies of other countries. In this case, devaluation increases the cost of foreign goods and decreases the cost of domestic goods to foreign firms. This is why it promotes exports of domestic goods. Some countries subtly impose unnecessarily burdensome and complex standards or requirements for imported goods. This is so-called bureaucratic red tape and is expensive for companies wanting to enter into the market. Cultural attitudes can also impede acceptance of products in foreign countries. For instance, the usage of colors in products. In Japan, black and white are the colors of mourning, so they should not be used in packaging. And in Brazil, purple is the color of death. So why do governments restrict trade? The reasons range from internal political and economic pressures to mistrust of other nations. Generally, nations want to export, but they are more reluctant to import. Thus, most trade restrictions are applied to imports from other nations. More specifically, trade might be restricted in order to equalize a nation's balance of payments. This is necessary to restore confidence in a country's monetary system, to protect a new industry that might not be strong, to support international competition, for protection of national security. Here, restrictions usually apply to technological products that must be kept out of hands of potential enemies, to protect the health of citizens, for instance, agricultural products that are contaminated, to retaliate in response of another country's restrictions, and to protect domestic jobs in domestic industries that cannot compete with international companies. However, trade restrictions also have negative consequences, and this includes higher prices for consumers because companies need to cover some of the costs in the form of higher prices. Restrictions of consumer choices when foreign competitors cannot enter in a domestic market. Misallocation or inefficient usage of international resources. And finally, loss of jobs in the exporting-oriented country. The trade restrictions usually benefit very few of the protected industries. Please take a moment to pause the video and explain why these sentences are true. Also, think of an example of an industry in which its exports receive subsidies. Use industries from your home country and share your comments in the space below. Are those subsidies pro-trade? How has the current world trade system emerged? After the destruction of World War II, countries recognized that something needed to be done in order to encourage cooperation and integration. So, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was organized with 153 nations participating. Next, different trends between protectionist and pro-trade occurred between 1980 and 1993. The Uruguay round of GATT negotiations started in 1986. When it was finalized in 1993, the World Trade Organization was created. The most controversial topics in the negotiations have been the trade of agricultural products and intellectual property rights. So let's think why these two topics have been controversial. The WTO, or World Trade Organization, is a non-profit organization regulating and promoting trade between its participant countries. When this graph was taken, Russia and former countries belonging to the USSR, for instance, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, did not belong to the WTO. Now in July 2016, there are 164 members of the WTO. Green countries are members, blue countries are dually represented by the EU, yellow countries are observers, and red are not members of the WTO. Among other things, participation in the WTO helps in the establishment of a unified and more transparent international trade system. This graph explains the different levels of economic integration. Levels of integration range from low to high. Examples of low economic integration are FTAs, or free trade areas or agreements. Political unions, where many countries cease to have borders, are examples of high levels of integration. The EU is an economic union. Integrate members, harmonize tax rates and common currencies. And not so much a political union because national laws and politics are still decided by separate countries. Multilateral integration has been the trend in the last decades. However, due to sluggish growth, now there is a rise in a nationalist, populist sentiment, and many countries are now reconsidering the effects of higher levels of integration, such as in the case of the EU. This graph shows countries and currencies that belong to the EU. Not all countries use the euro, and due to populist movements, country exits, like, for instance, Brexit, is threatening the survival of the Union. Another controversial agreement is the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This agreement would have reduced tariffs and increased trade in the Asian Pacific area. The 12 countries involved represent together almost 40% of the global GDP. However, with the change of the US administration, the future of this agreement seems bleak. For the last topic, let's discuss strategies that managers use for expanding global markets. Such strategies range from licensing with the least risk all the way to foreign direct investment with the most risk. With more risk, there is higher commitment and also higher profit potential. Each one of these strategies has disadvantages and advantages. A few examples are licensing, which is a contractual agreement where a firm allows another one to produce and market its products. In exchange for using its brand name, the company receives royalties or other compensations. A firm which uses licensing is Coca-Cola. In exporting, the level of obligation of the firm can range from very little to very high. Selling firms can use, for instance, an export-import merchant, which buys the product, and they have no further obligation. Or also selling firms can sell on commission, retaining ownership of the product. Lastly, they can establish a sales office in the foreign country. An interesting contractual strategy is franchising. Instead of selling a material product, in franchising, someone with a good idea for a business sells the rights to use a name, product, or service. Here, McDonald's is a famous example of franchising. Nike is an example of contract manufacturing. This is where a brand does not produce its own product. It instead outsources the manufacturing of its products and then adds its brand or trademark to it. Joint ventures are partnerships for a set period of time to achieve a specific goal. Volkswagen, for instance, used a joint venture with a Chinese company to break into the Chinese market. Joint ventures usually involve the creation of new, jointly owned company. Strategic alliances. Strategic alliances are partnerships between two or more companies. They are formed to create competitive advantage on a worldwide basis. And at the furthest end of the spectrum, there are totally owned facilities. This strategy allows the greatest control, but at the cost of the highest risk. Companies invest directly in the country, as in the case of Toyota in the United States. This concludes the presentation on Chapter 3. I hope you studied this material well in the videos and in your reading. Thank you for watching, and see you in the class.